Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world that smells faintly of rose water, hums with the soft flutter of doves, and looks suspiciously like paradise had a landscaper with OCD. You're standing barefoot on warm stone tiles in a Persian courtyard, a Chahar Bagh, to be precise, where the breeze moves like poetry, and the shadows are trimmed more neatly than your childhood hedges. It's quiet here, unnaturally so, like the garden is holding its breath just for you. Everywhere you look, there's balance. 4 square plots, split by water channels that trickle just loudly enough to remind you you're not dreaming. A faint scent of jasmine wafts past. It's the kind of place where nothing should go wrong. And yet you somehow know you probably wouldn't survive the construction phase of this ancient masterpiece. Between the desert heat, the subterranean engineering, and the sheer insistence on aesthetic perfection, you'd have quit on day 1 and gone home to invent the hammock. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the very heart of a Persian garden. But this isn't just any oasis. This is a carefully calculated marvel of human stubbornness and style. A silent rebellion against the desert. A poem carved in water and stone. The sun, of course, is blazing somewhere far above. But it never quite reaches you here. That's the trick. Every step you take has been designed not just to guide your feet, but to cool your skin, calm your mind, and, if you're a 6th century monarch, impress your enemies and seduce your allies. You're not alone. Servants once padded through these same paths, sandals whispering over marble. Noblemen traded passive-aggressive compliments while sipping pomegranate juice. Courtiers read half-finished love poems under fig trees and pretended not to notice the queen strolling by. But tonight, it's just you in the garden. You pass a mosaic-tiled fountain, not centered because nothing in Persian design is boringly literal, but precisely where the eye wants it to be. Scholars still argue whether this intuitive placement was mystical, mathematical, or just deeply passive-aggressive toward Roman architecture. Either way, it works. The garden isn't just a pleasure zone. It's a symbol of order over chaos, of water over desert, of life in balance. In Zoroastrian belief, the sacred element of water had to be protected, honored, and displayed, hence the fountains, the pools, the streams, not just because they were pretty, but because they were proof that civilization hadn't given up. You notice the walls now, tall and made of sun-baked clay, but coated with a plaster so fine it reflects heat away like a bored cat ignores affection. Beyond them lies the brutal desert, endless and glaring. Inside, it's all shade and murmurs. You step from one courtyard to another and feel the air change, as if the building is breathing with you. That, dear listener, is not an accident. Persian garden designers were many things, artists, engineers, priests, politicians, occasionally all four. They used geometry not just to measure space, but to shape meaning. Every garden was a little world, a taste of paradise made mortal. The word for paradise, in fact, comes from Old Persian, pyridieza, meaning walled enclosure. It was later picked up by Greeks, adapted by Christians, and eventually landed in your vocabulary to describe tropical resorts and 24-hour buffets. But the original paradise, you're standing in it. The path beneath you splits, not randomly, but symmetrically. 4 ways, always 4. Historians still argue whether this Chahar Bagh layout represents the 4 elements, the 4 seasons, or just looked really good from a palace balcony. You choose left, and the scent of mint brushes your nose. Mint and thyme were planted not just for their flavor, but for their cooling properties. Walk through enough of it, and even your anxiety might wilt a little. You pause beside a reflecting pool. The water's so still it seems frozen, but it's not. It's moving, gently, almost imperceptibly. That's a Qanat at work, though you'll meet that wonder in more detail soon. For now, you just stare into the pool and see your own sleepy face, surrounded by roses and ancient wisdom. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale chirps once, then falls silent. You sit. The stone is cool. Someone designed it to be that way, not by chance, not for fun, but because even 2,500 years ago, someone believed that beauty wasn't extra. It was necessary. And they built this garden not just to endure, but to soothe. Sleepy yet? That's just section 1. You're still sitting in the garden, though now the sun is just beginning its descent, casting long, lazy shadows that stretch across the tile like tired cats. The breeze picks up ever so slightly, carrying with it a scent you can't quite place. Earthy, sweet, almost like sun-warmed apricots, and something more ancient than fruit. It's time to understand just how all of this came to be. Because the truth is, this lush world you're lounging in shouldn't exist. Not here. Not in the middle of one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth. Ancient Persia, what today we'd map mostly as Iran, was never exactly lush by default. Much of the region is a dry, sun-blasted expanse where water plays a game of hide-and-seek with the sky. And the sky usually wins. If you wanted green here, you had to work for it. And oh, did they work? You picture yourself centuries earlier, standing on dry, cracked soil, squinting into a shimmering heat wave. There's no garden, no cypress trees, no fountains, just the deafening silence of nothing growing. And then, some bright-eyed, sand-dusted person mutters, "Let's dig a 40-kilometer underground tunnel and bring mountain water here instead." You know, casual. Historians still argue whether these early irrigation systems came from independent Persian innovation or were inspired by older Mesopotamian techniques. But either way, the Persians scaled the idea with stubborn brilliance. And the result? Lush garden courtyards like the one you're relaxing in now. a miracle of plumbing in the age of sandals. Creating a garden wasn't just about digging a few holes and tossing seeds in like an enthusiastic weekend gardener. It meant reshaping the very land. Flat desert became leveled terraces. Gravel and clay were mixed into sturdy garden walls. Trees were spaced with eerie precision, not just for beauty, but for shade optimization. That's right. Ancient Persian garden planners probably did more math than you ever will on a Sunday. And then came the topsoil, carried in sacks on the backs of donkeys, or servants, or very motivated royalty, no judgment. They brought in fertile soil from river valleys, layering it like cake over the reluctant desert. But even then, you still needed water. Enter the art of the garden basin. These weren't your average backyard bird baths. These were calculated reflections of the cosmos, shaped in squares, circles, and stars. The water wasn't just there to moisten roots. It was meant to cool the air, reflect the heavens, and probably impress your in-laws. The basins also allowed sediment to settle, cooling to occur, and serenity to bloom. You hear a splash, soft, rhythmic, hypnotic, as if the water is applauding its own cleverness. Honestly, it deserves it. You stroll through the edge of this green oasis now, and notice something. The further you walk, the cooler it gets. That's no accident. Gardens were designed with microclimates in mind, built around prevailing winds and sun exposure. Trees shaded walls, walls reflected heat, vines climbed arbors, draping your afternoon in dappled shade like leafy curtains drawn by nature's hand. And in the midst of this, people lived, really lived. You imagine the dusty sandals of a traveling merchant being swapped for soft slippers at the garden entrance, the way the heat drained from his bones the moment he stepped into the shade, the relief of cold water ladled from a clay jug, the quiet. Persian homes were often built around these gardens, not behind them, not adjacent, but wrapped around them, like a protective shell curling around a sacred pearl. The garden was the heart of the home, literally and metaphorically. Family life pulsed around it. Meals, poetry, gossip, naps, especially naps. And here's something extra quirky. Historians have found evidence that ancient garden walls were sometimes embedded with ceramic cones. Yes, cones designed to trap birds. Why? To silence them. Some nobles apparently preferred their paradise without ambient chirping. Others trained songbirds to sing on cue. That's right. Customizable soundtrack. Ancient edition. You reach a bench now, carved from pale limestone. Its edges are worn smooth from generations of lounging. You sit again, of course, because this is a story best told while horizontal. You tilt your head up and see grapes trailing overhead on a vine-covered trellis, shade, snacks, and shelter all in one lazy green swoop. And then it dawns on you. This wasn't a garden. It was survival, made beautiful. A rebellion against drought. A redefinition of wealth. Because in this world, the richest person wasn't the one with the most gold, but the one with the most shade and cold water. You feel that chill breeze again, just a whisper. It dances past your cheek, stirs the corner of your robe. Yes, you're wearing robes now. Go with it. And disappears into the vines. And in that moment, under the grape leaves, beside a pool shaped like the moon, with water trickling in tune with your heartbeat, you understand this garden isn't just cooling the air. It's cooling your soul. You're still sitting there, robe billowing faintly in the whispering air. When you feel it again, that curious sense of coolness that shouldn't exist here. Not in this desert, not in this heat, and definitely not just because of a few shade trees. It's time you met the unsung hero of Persian paradise making, the Qanat. Now, before your brain decides to snooze completely, which, to be fair, is the point of all this, let's gently nudge it into imagining a massive engineering project. Done in complete darkness, at a downward slope, and without GPS, or power tools, or even decent shoes. A Qanat is essentially an underground aqueduct, a sloped tunnel carved meticulously through mountains and hills to deliver cool, fresh water from an underground source to surface-level gardens, homes, and cities. Think of it as ancient Persia's version of room temperature plumbing, minus the sink gurgles and the existential dread that comes with opening a water bill. The slope was key. Not too steep, lest the water rushes like a caffeinated toddler, but not too flat either. Just the right angle to allow gravity to do its thing slowly and gracefully. Kind of like how you walk to the kitchen for midnight snacks. Historians still argue whether Qanats were entirely a Persian invention or adapted from earlier Mesopotamian or Egyptian water channels. What we do know, the Persians perfected them. And they didn't just build one or two. They built thousands, across mountains, beneath cities, even through layers of rock harder than a Spartan's abs. Picture this. Teams of workers digging vertical shafts down into the earth every 20 to 30 meters, then carefully connecting those shafts with gently sloped tunnels that stretched for kilometers. The tunnels had to stay cool, dry, and stable. And all this was calculated without modern surveying tools. It's the kind of project that would cause several modern contractors to mysteriously disappear halfway through, and yet it worked. You rise from your bench, now curious about what lies beneath your feet. You imagine, just below the soil, a gentle flow of icy mountain water, snaking silently through dark stone channels. No pumps, no engines, just gravity and brilliant design. The Qanats weren't just for gardens, of course. They fed drinking water to entire cities. They powered small mills. They even served as emergency escape tunnels in some cases, though that bit was more of a side perk than a design feature. Not that you'd want to escape from a place like this, really, unless someone replaced the figs with raisins. Then we riot. But back to our water. Once the Qanat reached the garden's edge, it emerged from the earth in a trickling channel, sometimes feeding a basin, sometimes disappearing beneath the courtyard again to feed lower terraces. It was all part of an invisible choreography that you could hear more than you could see. The soft trickle of water against stone. The hush of it sliding past roots, the occasional plunk of a dropped plum. here's the part you'll love. The Qanat system, by nature of its underground design, kept water cool. Not just not hot, but deliciously cool. Like that first sip from a mountain stream that makes you question your bottled water choices forever. This cool water then cooled the air around it. And the breeze, often pulled gently through tunnels or over pools, carried that temperature drop through the entire courtyard. Essentially, the Qanat was the heart of the entire garden. The lungs, too, and maybe the spleen. Look, anatomy metaphors aside, nothing in the Persian courtyard would function or exist without it. You walk now along a narrow channel where water dances over smooth pebbles. The air smells like stone and moss, though you haven't seen either. You dip a finger in the stream. It's cold. Not refreshing spa day cold. Real cold. Wake up the nerves cold. You'd be annoyed if it weren't also kind of magical. Some scholars argue that the construction and maintenance of Qanats created an entire profession. A respected class of workers called muqannis, who passed their knowledge down like precious family recipes. These weren't ditch diggers. These were hydraulic sages, entrusted with the lifeblood of entire communities. And they were also incredibly fit, apparently. Climbing down 30 meters of vertical shaft just to clean out pebbles and realign slopes, that's not an arm workout. That's a career in acrobatics. Even today, some of these Qanats still function in places where time has slumbered under dust and heat. Water still flows through tunnels carved centuries ago. You could step into one, duck your head under a stone arch, and listen as ancient technology whispers that it never needed a patent. The sun is dipping now, the garden growing cooler with each passing minute. You sit again, back near the reflecting pool, and feel the temperature drop. It's not just the air, it's the stones under your hand, the water beside your feet. Everything here is conspiring to lull you into comfort, into quiet, into a kind of engineered peace. And beneath it all, far below, the Qanat continues its work, silently, constantly, just for you. The sun has nearly slipped behind the horizon now, casting the garden in a warm amber glow that glints off the water like liquid gold. You trace a finger along the low stone wall bordering the channel, marveling at how something so old could feel so deliberate. Like every pebble was placed by someone who cared too much about symmetry and not enough about weekends. That's the thing about ancient Persia. They didn't just respect water, they worshipped it. Not in the literal, altar-burning sense. Well, okay, sometimes. But in the deep cultural and spiritual sense. Water was more than a resource. It was life. And in Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion before Islam arrived, it was also one of the purest sacred elements. You wouldn't just splash around in it carelessly. Oh no. Water had rules. In Zoroastrian thought, water was to be protected from pollution. You couldn't spit in it, bathe your goats in it, or dump your leftover stew into it. Even washing your hands had to be done carefully, so as not to offend the spirit of the water. You start to realize that this reverence might explain why these gardens were so meticulously tidy. No crumpled fig wrappers, no sandal scuffs, just serenity. Historians still argue whether the garden layouts mirrored paradise described in ancient Zoroastrian texts, or if they were just highly aesthetic urban planning. What's clear is that each element, the water channels, the shade trees, the careful geometry, carried layers of meaning. Water ran through the garden like veins through a body, always in motion, always central. A continuous flow not just of refreshment, but of spiritual renewal. You pause beside a central basin. It's circular, rimmed in hand-laid turquoise tiles that shimmer in the dying light. The water is motionless now, except for a single drop that lands from a leaf above. Plink. Ripples spread outward, breaking the perfect mirror. You squint, and for a moment, you can almost see stars. This basin isn't just decorative, it's symbolic. In many Persian gardens, water was arranged in forms that echoed the heavens. Star-shaped fountains, moon-like pools, rivulets carved to reflect constellations. Some believe these were literal representations of cosmic order. As above, so below. The garden wasn't just pretty, it was the universe, miniaturized and irrigated. You stroll further and come across a stone stele etched with script, Old Persian. Perhaps you can't read it, but that's okay. Its presence is enough. You know it says something poetic, something about water or life, or maybe just an ancient joke about how hard it is to find good gardeners these days. Then, as if summoned by your thoughts, you hear it, the faintest, most delicate sound, dripping water from a hidden source. It's not constant. It's timed, designed, a soft drop every few seconds. Not fast enough to startle, just enough to remind you that time is flowing here, but slowly and with intention. This wasn't an accident either. Many gardens included timed drip fountains, sometimes carved into lion heads or bird beaks, not just for beauty, but for tempo, like a metronome for your soul. The sound would fill the garden with rhythm, offering a natural pacing to conversations, meditations, or awkward royal family gatherings. You sit again, because apparently that's your default mode in this garden, sitting and staring at things in profound awe. This time it's a narrow channel beside a row of flowering shrubs. The water here is moving a little faster, bubbling quietly as it dances through a series of tiny steps. Like a baby waterfall that never learned to be loud. The air cools around it, and it dawns on you. This isn't a garden with water in it. It's a garden made of water. Every path, every planting, every shadow depends on where the water flows, how fast it moves, and whether it can reflect the sky just right. And what about the plants? Surely the garden would be lush and fragrant. Of course, but not just randomly fragrant. No, sir. Ancient Persian horticulturists chose plants based on 3 key factors: shade coverage, scent profile, and mood enhancement. That's right. They curated vibes before curated vibes was a thing. Roses were prized, obviously. Especially damask roses, whose scent was strong enough to drift across courtyards and into your dreams. Jasmine, mint, lilac, myrtle, each had its own corner, its own patch, its own mood. You could take a walk and essentially sniff your way through a garden-long aromatherapy session. Step aside, scented candles, you reach a patch of sweetbriar. Brushing your fingers along its velvety leaves, you inhale. It's a little like honey, a little like a grandmother's hug. You decide this patch is your favorite. For now, some scholars believe that Persian gardens were aligned with the stars during construction, placed according to celestial events or cardinal directions to maximize harmony. Others say the builders just had really good spatial awareness and impressive chalk. Either way, it worked. You feel more at peace than you have in weeks. You lie down now. Finally. The cool stone beneath you, the scent of night-blooming flowers all around, and that soft trickle of sacred water nearby. The desert may still roar outside these walls, but in here, only hush. The stars have come out now, glimmering like tiny diamonds scattered across indigo silk. You're still lying on the smooth courtyard tiles, your back warmed faintly by the stone's memory of sunlight, but your face cooled by the breeze that continues to glide silently through the space. You close your eyes, but the garden continues to move around you, alive in its quiet choreography. Above you looms a structure that might look, at first glance, like a minaret or chimney, but no call to prayer echoes from it. No smoke spills forth. Instead, this is something more mysterious and, frankly, more impressive. This is a windcatcher. The Persians called it Badgir, literally wind grabber, and that's exactly what it did. Imagine an air conditioner, but made of mud brick, geometry, and spite toward the sun. The Badgir is an architectural feature that sits atop buildings, sometimes a single tower, sometimes multiple, each facing a different direction like curious sentinels. Their job? To pull in the slightest breath of wind from outside and funnel it downward into the rooms and courtyards below. It's not magic, but it might as well be. You sit up and trace the lines of the nearest windcatcher with your eyes. Its narrow slits face the wind, and inside, a clever network of baffles, channels, and sometimes even moist pads cool the air as it descends. The breeze that tickles your cheek right now, that's not nature's accident. That's architectural intent. Historians still argue whether the earliest windcatchers were Persian inventions or borrowed from Egyptian or Babylonian designs. What's agreed on is that Persia turned it into an art. In Yazd, an ancient city in Iran, you can still find buildings topped with forests of badgirs, catching and cooling desert air like musical instruments of wind. You wander to a side room just off the courtyard now, a domed chamber, open on one side, where air flows in with a distinct hush. You step inside, and the temperature drops. Not dramatically, but enough to make you sigh. The windcatcher's work is subtle, constant, like a loyal servant you never have to thank. This room, called a sardab, or cold water room, is one of the most tranquil spaces in the entire house. The floor might sit slightly below courtyard level. There might be a small pool in the center. The walls are thick, the plaster smooth, the light dim but golden. You imagine nobles retreating here in the hottest months, sipping cold rose water and writing love poems that were more emotional than coherent. You lie back again, this time beneath the dome. Your eyes wander the plasterwork, delicate patterns carved into the ceiling like lace and stone. The air moves past your ears in slow pulses, whispering through unseen cracks. There's something deeply restful about it. No machinery, no whirring, just the earth, air, and clever angles, sometimes, to boost the cooling. A windcatcher's incoming air was routed across a pool or fountain inside the house. The evaporation chilled the air further, turning entire homes into early examples of climate-controlled living. You think about your modern air conditioner, humming clumsily in a corner back home, and sigh with faint disappointment. This ancient system is quieter, gentler, and entirely powered by the breeze. In some houses, the system was reversed. Instead of drawing air in, the windcatcher created negative pressure to suck warm air out. Bidirectional ventilation. A concept your last apartment clearly never considered. Even royalty relied on these passive cooling systems. In elaborate palaces, windcatchers were paired with vast underground storage rooms called yakchals, where ice harvested in winter or transported from mountains was stored year-round. You could walk from a scorching summer courtyard into a chamber with literal ice in it, cooled by a combination of airflow, shade, and deep, dry silence. Yes, the ancient Persians had refrigerators before you had TikTok. Some windcatchers were capped with intricate wooden lattices, not just for aesthetics, but to filter dust and insects. You picture a servant replacing one of those filters, muttering about how the boss keeps planting mint too close to the vents. You move back into the courtyard now, and everything feels cooler. Not just in temperature, but in mood. The garden is quieter. The scent of roses has faded into something muskier, perhaps night-blooming jasmine. The pool reflects the stars now, perfectly still, as if the sky has knelt to admire itself. You sit on the edge, letting your feet dangle just above the surface. No ripples, no urgency, just the occasional sound of a leaf drifting downward. Somewhere in the windcatcher above, a soft creak echoes, like the structure stretching in its sleep. This whole system, the Qanat, the garden, the windcatcher, isn't a collection of separate inventions. It's a symphony. One that plays air and water like instruments. One that turns harsh climate into comfort. One that has lulled kings, poets, servants, and now you, into calm. And as you sit there, a soft breeze gliding down through a 2,000-year-old design to cool your cheek, you wonder, who was the first to think of catching the wind? You wake, though barely, with your chin tilted back and the stone edge of the fountain cooling your spine. Above you, the sky is thick with stars, and the garden has taken on its nighttime voice. Crickets chirp lazily, and in the shadows, a dove shuffles sleepily in the branches. Everything is slower now, dimmer, except the scent. Somehow, that's gotten stronger. And just then, your eyes catch the ground beneath your feet. Not dirt, not gravel, but stone, smooth, cool, and gleaming, even by starlight. You stand and step lightly across a floor made of polished marble, laid with such care that it still reflects flickers of starlight. Even centuries after its first cleaning, this is no humble flooring. This is a trick, a design, a scientific solution wrapped in elegance. The ancient Persians knew that materials mattered. Marble, and in some places alabaster or polished limestone, wasn't just pretty, it had thermal properties. During the day, these stones absorbed minimal heat. At night, they radiated back the desert's lost chill. You walk barefoot now, and each step feels like a sip of iced tea for your soles. Historians still argue whether the precise type of marble used in elite Persian homes came from local quarries or was imported along trading routes from as far as Anatolia. Either way, they didn't cheap out. These floors were an investment in temperature management, a way to outwit the sun. You wander now along a hallway bordering the courtyard. Its floor isn't just a flat plane, it's subtly sloped. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. But yes, that's deliberate. The slope channels any spilled water away from the living space, toward garden beds or side channels. A passive drainage system hidden beneath opulence. And here's a clever quirk. In some palace gardens, those floors weren't just made of smooth stone. They were carved with micro grooves, invisible unless the light hit just right. These grooves weren't decorative. They were anti-slip. Even the most elegant robe-wearing nobleman occasionally walked with damp sandals. And slipping in front of royalty? Not ideal. The Persians made sure your embarrassment was structurally mitigated. You stop and admire the tile work, geometric patterns inlaid with semi-precious stones, each shape echoing the garden's greater symmetry. The tiles reflect light from bronze lanterns still hanging from ornate hooks. You imagine the flame flickering softly, casting geometric shadows like a mobile art installation dreamed up by the wind. In this space, everything's multi-purpose. Beauty is never without reason. Comfort is never without calculation. You reach a corner platform, slightly raised, lined with cushions, and facing a crescent-shaped pool. This, you gather, is where the evening gatherings happened. Poetry readings, cardamom tea, gossip, probably a lute or two. Maybe someone dramatically sighing about the price of imported dates. Evenings in Persian courtyards weren't just social. They were strategic. Temperatures were bearable. Airflow was optimal. And the polished stone surfaces had cooled to the perfect lounge temperature. You lean back onto a faded cushion and let your hands rest against the floor. It's like pressing your palms against the inside of a refrigerator made of poetry. And the best part? These floors amplified sound. The materials and layout were chosen not just for thermal benefit, but for acoustic magic. Someone whispering across the courtyard could be heard clearly, if the garden allowed it. Conversations floated gently, music carried softly, laughter bounced politely off the walls without ever becoming intrusive. Some scholars believe garden architects designed specific sitting spots to enhance the oral geometry of gatherings. That's right. Sound design. In the 5th century BCE. Take that, podcast studios. You slowly rise and begin to walk again. The breeze follows you, not rushing, just trailing behind like a loyal friend. Each step clicks softly against the marble. It's the kind of sound that would make modern minimalist architects swoon. You pass through a small archway into an antechamber, another polished floor, this time with scattered ceramic bowls laid along the walls. They're not decorative. These were once evaporation coolers, shallow basins filled with water and placed strategically to chill the surrounding air. A bowl of water here, a slab of marble there, and suddenly your room feels 20 degrees cooler than the desert outside. You crouch beside one. The bowl's glaze has cracked with age, tiny spider web lines tracing its surface like forgotten constellations. But there's still water in it, and if you lean close enough, you can feel it working, cooling the air quietly. In a world without buttons or thermostats, this was luxury. This was technology. This was survival by design. You sit again because in this garden, sitting is practically a religion. And listen, not just to the breeze or the soft gurgle of a distant fountain, but to the silence between those sounds. That, too, was engineered. The thick walls, the plant density, the direction of pathways, all serve to muffle noise, creating a rare, immersive stillness. A place where you could hear your thoughts slow down or disappear entirely. And it's here, in the hush of polished stone and fragrant air, that you realize something. The Persians didn't just build gardens, they built peace. You stretch slowly, letting your fingers trail across the cool marble as you rise. The polished stone has done its job, gently bleeding away the last of the desert's heat, as if whispering, "There's no rush. Stay a while." And you do. You step back into the main courtyard, where night has fully claimed the sky and the plants seem even more alive in the moonlight. From somewhere close, the smell of citrus floats toward you. You follow it, past rose bushes, through a vine-draped archway, and into a garden plot thick with orange blossoms and lemon trees. The garden's hidden perfume vault. The air here is dense with aroma. Not heavy or sickly, but bright and awakening. Like a dream you didn't know you were in until someone handed you a slice of lime. You inhale, and every breath feels medicinal. That wasn't a coincidence. The ancient Persian garden wasn't just a pretty face. It was a pharmacy, a pantry, a perfume lab, and, depending on the night, an exotic bird sanctuary. Every plant had a purpose. Scent was one thing, but healing, that was just as important. You bend beside a row of basil, not the supermarket kind. but a wild variety that smells faintly of licorice and clean soil. Nearby, fenugreek curls upward in modest little clusters, while coriander spreads low and wide like it's trying not to be noticed. Each herb was placed with the care of a painter choosing a color. Each one contributed to the garden's invisible ecosystem of scent, shade, and health. Historians still debate whether Persian physicians helped design certain palace gardens, or whether court gardeners simply followed ancient manuals passed down through families. Either way, there's no doubt these gardens were living pharmacies. You kneel beside a cluster of saffron crocuses, tiny violet flowers poking through the soil like bashful dancers. You smile. A few petals for color, a few threads for the stew, and voila. Your dinner is better and your bad mood cured. Even the fruit trees were dual purpose. Pomegranates weren't just juicy and dramatic looking. They symbolized fertility, abundance, and royal power. Quinces, sour as they might be, were prized for jams and medicinal syrups. And figs, figs, the lazy fruit, ripening silently, always a little wrinkled, always just a bit too soft. You pick one now, from a low branch, and hold it up. In the moonlight, it glows faintly golden. Soft skin, slightly cracked, ready to fall apart at the slightest pressure. You bite. It's syrupy, with a taste somewhere between honey and memory. Further in, you hear it, a bubbling sound that's too playful for a canal. You turn a corner and find a small fountain, shaped like a lotus, its petals carved from white stone. Water gurgles from the center and overflows into a shallow basin where citrus blossoms float lazily. But look closely. This isn't just decoration. It's a scent diffuser. The floating blossoms warm slightly under the moonlight, releasing their oils. The moving water lifts the scent and carries it across the garden on the breeze. A 1,000-year-old essential oil diffuser, powered by gravity and genius. You walk again, past a wall draped in climbing roses. Their scent, potent even in the cool of night, rises like music. Some say the Persian obsession with roses borders on the divine. In fact, in some court gardens, gardeners were instructed to cut roses at very specific times of day, when the dew had settled, but before the sun could steal their fragrance. And then there were the scent paths. You pause at the entrance of one now, a narrow corridor of plantings that leads through a deliberately curated scent journey. First jasmine, then mint, then orange blossom, then rose. Each step delivers a new note, a new tone, a new feeling. Some scholars believe these paths were designed to evoke emotion, to calm, excite, or even seduce. Courtiers might stroll through before a diplomatic meeting or a romantic rendezvous, letting scent prime their senses like perfume for the soul. You walk it now, slowly. With each step, the air shifts. Jasmine relaxes you. Mint sharpens your thoughts. Orange blossom lifts your mood. Rose nearly stops you in your tracks. It's overwhelming, in the gentlest way possible. Near the end of the path, you find a stone bench, low and wide, with vine-carved legs and flower petals scattered across the seat, whether by wind or by a poetic servant. You'll never know. You sit again. The breeze rises slightly, and you feel the night's breath stir your hair. You close your eyes. All around. The garden works silently. Plants exhale. Water dances. Stones whisper coolness. And through it all flows scent, invisible, timeless, and just complex enough to keep you breathing deeply. This isn't just gardening. It's olfactory architecture. It's a love letter to your nose, written by a civilization that believed fragrance was part of the divine. And maybe they were right. You linger on the bench, the last notes of rose and citrus still clinging to your skin like a barely remembered melody. The air has cooled more now, not with chill, but with calm, a quiet softness that settles into your clothes, your bones, your thoughts. And then, just above you, a flutter. You look up to see a small bird hopping lightly along a wooden beam. It tilts its head, watching you with the unimpressed gaze of a long-time resident. A few feet away, another joins in, cooing gently, and then another, a whole ensemble of feathery night shift musicians, perched in the shadows. You've just wandered into another brilliant feature of the Persian Garden, its engineered soundscape. Yes, sound, not just water trickling or leaves rustling, but curated bird calls, arranged breezes, and garden designs that made silence sing. It wasn't random. It wasn't luck. The garden was tuned, like an instrument, and you're in the middle of its slow nocturne. Let's start with the birds. In ancient Persian gardens, birds were not just tolerated, they were welcomed. Specific trees and perches were added to attract particular species. Tall cypresses, pomegranate hedges, fruit trees, each offered either food or shelter. Courtyard designers even placed shallow basins specifically for birds to drink and bathe, sometimes with raised rims to keep cats from ruining the vibe. Some birds, like nightingales and bulbuls, were especially prized for their calls. Their presence was seen as a symbol of paradise, especially when paired with roses. The nightingale and the rose would become a poetic cliché in Persian literature. But in the garden, it was very real. You could sit, cup of tea in hand, and actually listen to the metaphor sing. You smile as one bird hops closer, then flits off again into the citrus branches. No fear, just routine. And then there's the wind. You shift your ears and notice it, how the breeze moves through the garden. It's not random. The channels and openings in the walls, the trellises, the vine-covered walkways, they're placed in such a way that air moves through the space like a slow river. The Windcatcher may be the most famous feature, but here in the open garden, it's the planting density and pathway curvature that shapes the airflow. Some garden layouts were deliberately designed to create soft wind tunnels, gentle whooshes that guided air past water basins and through flower-scented paths. The sound of that moving air, not unlike distant waves or rustling silk. You notice it now. It's barely there, but it's there. Like the garden is breathing. Historians still debate how much of this was scientific and how much was intuition. Did architects understand aerodynamics? Probably not in the way we do now, but they understood results, and they observed them, refined them, passed them down. You stand and stroll again. Your steps make a soft scuff against the gravel path, another deliberate choice. In some parts of the garden, paths were left gravelly to muffle conversation, encouraging quiet. In others, they were paved to amplify footsteps, lending weight and presence to each person who passed. You've just moved from a quiet zone into a place where your steps are music. You pause beside a column where a cluster of ceramic jugs hangs from a shelf. You lean in. They're not storing water. They're empty, arranged by size, and when the wind blows just right, they hum. A low, breathy tone, barely perceptible, like the garden sighing. You smile. Someone added that on purpose. And then there's the water music. You return to the central fountain, and now, with your ears tuned, you notice it anew. The water doesn't just fall. It taps, trickles, whispers. In some cases, Persian engineers adjusted spout diameter, basin depth, and even stone shape to create specific sounds. A shallow spout might plink like raindrops on a ceramic roof. A deeper channel might gurgle like a baby trying to tell you a secret. And a gentle cascade over a carved lip might ripple like silk unraveling. Even the order of these sounds mattered. A walk through a palace garden might take you from fast, energizing water noises in the entry path to slow, sleep-inducing murmurs near the seating area. You've just moved into the slow zone. And so, you do what this garden has been nudging you to do all along. You sit again. This time, on a low cushioned platform placed near a narrow stream. You listen, not just with your ears, but with your body. The sounds aren't loud. They're not demanding. They just are, always there, like a heartbeat, like waves, like breath, the wind through the lemon trees, the flutter of feathers overhead, the water tapping over polished stone. And in this carefully curated orchestra of hush and whisper, you find something astonishing, not silence, but peaceful presence. Because this garden wasn't meant to be quiet. It was meant to be soothingly alive. You're still resting beside the stream, lulled by the low murmur of moving water and the breeze that knows exactly when to arrive. But now, let's talk about the part that really shouldn't make sense. How the entire garden stays cool even in the middle of a desert where the rocks themselves seem to sweat during the day. It's time to explore how the garden itself became the air conditioner. Yes, it sounds dramatic. But the Persian courtyard didn't just exist in spite of the desert. It thrived because its builders outsmarted the climate. Every detail you've seen so far, the fountains, the windcatchers, the marble floors, the dense trees, they all work together in a kind of passive cooling conspiracy. And you, sleepy listener, are the beneficiary. Start with the layout. The garden is sunk slightly into the ground. You probably didn't notice it at first, but your legs did. This isn't just for privacy or aesthetics. It creates a cooler microclimate. The soil insulates the space, holding in nighttime coolness and repelling daytime heat. Even a few feet of depth can reduce temperature by several degrees. That may not sound like much until you realize it's the difference between napping peacefully and melting into your own sandal. The garden is also walled on all sides, which provides shade and reduces the impact of wind-blown dust. But the walls aren't just barriers, they're tools. Their high mass absorbs solar heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. This thermal lag creates a steady, mild atmosphere inside the courtyard, while the world outside turns into a convection oven. Then there's vegetation. The trees aren't just decorative, they're deployed like climate control officers. Tall cypress trees line the perimeters, acting like green pillars of insulation. Beneath them are fruit trees, their canopies layered to provide dappled shade while still allowing breezes to flow. Historians still argue whether the layering was based on botanical science or was simply the result of centuries of observation and garden trial and error. Either way, it works. The mix of canopy, mid-level foliage, and ground plants creates evapotranspiration, a fancy word meaning the plants breathe out water vapor, which cools the air. You've probably felt it already, that distinct difference when you move from dry air into a garden space thick with green, that faint moisture in the breeze. That's the garden exhaling. Now, combine that with water. Oh, the water. You walk now along a runnel, a narrow stone channel carved to carry water throughout the courtyard. As water flows along it, something magical happens. Evaporative cooling. The sun heats the water, causing evaporation, which pulls heat from the surrounding air. This process is silent, efficient, and centuries ahead of its time. You don't hear compressors or see blinking thermostats. The only indicator of the system working is the way your skin stops sweating as much the moment you cross the threshold into the courtyard. And then there's the architecture itself. You walk toward a side alcove now, a semi-enclosed iwan with 3 open sides and a high vaulted ceiling. The shape isn't random. It's designed to capture wind, redirect light, and create cool resting areas that shift with the sun's position. You enter the space, and immediately, the temperature drops, not sharply, gently, like walking into the shade of a cloud. The breeze filters in and circles the room before exiting upward through a small gap in the vaulted ceiling. That's convection at work, warm air rising, cool air settling, and you caught blissfully in the middle. Some larger homes even incorporated subterranean escape zones known as house canes, essentially cold rooms with pools and water features entirely underground. The combination of earth insulation, water, and minimal light made these spaces dramatically cooler than the upper levels. You think about crawling down into one now, just to see what an ancient cold room feels like. And here's a quirky detail. Certain tiles used in these areas were glazed with colors that reflected light, especially blues and whites. These weren't just pretty, they were strategic. Light-colored surfaces absorbed less heat and visually cooled the space, something interior designers still try to replicate in modern spa brochures. Even the placement of windows followed cooling logic. You notice one now? Small, high, and arched. It lets in air, not heat. Light, not glare. The windows often faced north, away from the worst of the sun, and were shaded with wooden lattices, mashrabiyah, or silk curtains soaked in rosewater for added fragrance and dampness. Yes, you heard right. Perfumed curtains designed to scent and cool the air simultaneously. You lean your head against one of the columns in the Iwan, feeling the stone's coolness radiate into your skin. It's not air conditioning in the way we think of it. It's better. It's natural air orchestration. A symphony of elements: stone, water, wind, shadow, all moving together in a wordless plan to make you feel calm, safe, and ever so slightly sleepy. The sun may have gone down long ago, but the garden's work never ends. It will keep cooling, keep flowing, keep whispering comfort long after everyone has gone to bed. And you're already halfway there. The garden has now embraced full night, and the stars have multiplied above like glimmering coins tossed across a velvet cloth. You breathe slowly, feeling the rhythm of the courtyard beneath your bare feet, the hum of stillness in the air. And now, you look up again, your gaze drawn back to those curious vertical towers rising above the walls. You've seen them already, felt their effects. But it's time to truly meet the windcatchers. Not just as cooling devices, but as the silent sentinels of Persian design. You step into a shaded corridor, your fingertips brushing the stucco as you pass. At its far end, a spiral stairway beckons, tight and steep. You ascend slowly, the stone cool beneath your palms. Finally, you emerge into a windcatcher's upper chamber. And here, dear listener, is where the breeze is born. This is no ordinary rooftop. It's part science lab, part poetry studio. The windcatcher, Badgir, has openings on multiple sides, each facing a different cardinal direction. The openings are tall, slender, and louvered, creating suction when even the faintest breeze passes by. You peek into one slit and feel it, a steady pull of air, as if the garden is quietly inhaling. But this isn't just a medieval ceiling fan. Some Badgirs were even connected to Qanats below, those underground water tunnels you admired earlier. The air would pass over the cool water surface in the Qanat, chilling as it flowed up into the rooms above. An airwell effect, engineered without blueprints or software. Just stone, instinct, and a deep understanding of how heat moves. You stand now at the center of the chamber, arms out, and feel the air slide past you in slow, even waves. It enters from one side and exits from another, or down into a shaft below. The room itself is quiet, the air louder than your own breath, and for a moment, you feel suspended, hovering in a space between motion and rest. Historians still debate the exact origins of the Badgir. Some credit early models in ancient Mesopotamia. Others claim Egypt or the Indus Valley. But most agree that Persia perfected the concept. especially in cities like Yazd, where Badgirs became a defining feature of the skyline. Some towers reached 10 meters high, their insides divided into channels to catch wind from any angle. Because sometimes the desert didn't cooperate. You picture the engineers planning it out, sketching lines in the sand, adjusting walls by inches, testing air with hanging cloth. Trial, error, and a touch of obsession, because if your palace guests fainted from heat stroke, you lost more than hospitality. You lost face. And no one wants to be the sultan known for sweaty banquets. You descend again now, the cool air following you like a polite servant. At the bottom of the stairwell, a wide room awaits, domed ceiling, tall arched doors, floor cushions laid out in sleepy semicircles. This would have been a reception chamber, not the grand throne room, but a more intimate space for storytelling. Quiet tea, or that one courtier who insisted on reading poetry no one understood. And the air here? Perfect. Still, even, a soft caress on the back of your neck. You sink into a cushion, the silk still faintly warm from the day. You can hear the faintest whisper of the windcatcher overhead, air passing through stone like breath through a flute. If you hadn't walked up there yourself, you'd think the room was enchanted. You look around and notice the details. Painted ceilings, curling with floral and geometric patterns, carved niches for oil lamps, curtains of gauze, tied back now but ready to be drawn when the moon becomes too bold. And then, your ears catch it. A soft chime, metal tapping gently, rhythmically. You turn toward the source, a small pendulum chime, placed in the path of the airflow. It swings slowly, delicately, like a heartbeat with insomnia. Not loud, not attention-seeking, just there. This wasn't decoration. It was airflow verification. Garden keepers and household staff could walk into a room, see the chime swinging, and know the Badgir was working. If it stood still, they knew to check for clogs, or adjust window coverings, or, worst case, actually do physical labor. You smile at the simplicity, low tech, high charm, but windcatchers weren't just for the elite. In cities, common homes had their own mini versions, shorter towers, sometimes with clay pots hung inside to moisten and further cool the air. Even ice houses, used to store blocks of winter ice deep underground, were paired with windcatchers to help preserve cold air year-round. You lean back and let the breeze do its work. Above you, the Badgir watches the sky. Below you, the garden sleeps. And between the two, the air moves, effortlessly, endlessly, cooling more than your body, cooling your mind. The wind has become part of you now, a gentle rhythm wrapped around your limbs like a soft shawl. You stretch out once again across the polished floor, watching the shadows dance across the domed ceiling. And now it's time to pay attention to the detail beneath you. The very thing your feet have glided across all evening without quite realizing the artistry below. Let's talk about Persian floors, and more specifically, the smooth, often slippery, marble masterpieces that weren't just made for walking, but for cooling, reflecting, and occasionally making you fall flat on your face. You rise and step into the largest section of the courtyard, where the moonlight gleams off a wide expanse of stone tiles. The marble is pale, almost white, flecked with veins of silver and gray. It looks clean enough to eat off of. Not that you should, unless you're emotionally prepared for a historical dental mishap involving quince paste and pride. These weren't basic stone slabs. Persian garden floors were often composed of marble, alabaster, or glazed tiles, chosen not just for beauty, but for their thermal and optical properties. During the searing daytime hours, the pale color reflected sunlight, reducing absorption and keeping the surface several degrees cooler than the surrounding air. You take a few steps across the expanse and realize this floor isn't just smooth. It's slippery, slick, polished until it shines like a mirror on a sleepy lake. And yes, there's a reason for that too. This was part of the cooling strategy. When combined with a fine mist of evaporating water from nearby fountains or channels, the floor's surface chilled quickly and retained that chill long into the night. Walking barefoot across it now, you feel like you're floating on a silk sheet stretched across a glacier. Historians still argue whether this marble polishing was strictly utilitarian or partially ceremonial. Some believe that the act of tending the floor, mopping, buffing, cooling with flower-scented water, was itself a ritual of hospitality and reverence. After all, you wouldn't invite a guest into your home and ask them to sit on a lukewarm floor like a peasant. You pass over a square where the floor tiles change slightly. Here, geometric mosaics replace the plain marble, intricate starbursts, interlocking hexagons, and scrolling calligraphy in faded lapis lazuli. The placement is not random. This was a focus zone, a kind of visual meditation spot, a Persian version of the reading nook, except far more impressive and slightly intimidating. You kneel, tracing the cold tile with your fingertips. The blue pigment still holds its depth. The patterns seem to pulse and shift if you stare too long, pulling you into their symmetry like a dream you're not entirely ready to wake from. Nearby, another section of the floor catches your attention. It's textured, but subtly so. Here the tiles are incised with tiny grooves, almost invisible at first glance, but absolutely crucial if your goal is avoid comedic slip and slide into the reflecting pool. The grooves offered grip during water ceremonies or summer storms, and they made it possible to dance, to move, to spill a bit of rose sherbet without triggering a lawsuit. Some records suggest these floors were cooled deliberately before special events. Servants might spread damp cloths across the surface in the hours before guests arrived, allowing evaporation to pre-chill the space. Imagine entering a stone chamber in the middle of summer and feeling your toes curl with pleasure. Not from ornate decorations, but because the very floor loved you. You sit now, cross-legged in the middle of the courtyard, moon above, water beside you, and that glorious marble cool beneath. Your breath comes slowly. You realize something. This floor has not just been built for comfort, it's been built to last. Many of these original courtyard floors are still intact. That's how well they were made. Cut and laid by hand, grouted with mixtures of lime and crushed brick, burnished with wax or oils, depending on the century and region. Maintenance was part of the ritual. Daily sweepings, weekly washings, and seasonal touch-ups meant the floor was never just there. It was alive. It was a character in the garden's silent play. You lie back, now completely stretched across the tiles, and stare up at the stars. The stone at your spine is as cool as a secret. You press your palms flat, feeling the ancient molecules hum quietly beneath. And then you realize the floor isn't just a surface, it's a conductor. It carries the chill of water, the whisper of wind, the echo of footsteps, the scent of blossoms fallen in the night. It's part of the garden's nervous system, touching everything, connecting everything. In most homes, the floor is just where you drop your keys. Here, it's where peace begins. Your back presses into the cool marble, and for a long moment, you simply lie there, eyes half closed, as though the garden itself has drawn you into its slow breath. But something stirs in you now, a curiosity. You've seen the quiet corners, the scent paths, the engineering marvels. But what about the grand stage, the centerpiece of it all? You rise, gently, and follow a wide path toward what must once have been a royal pavilion, the beating heart of a king's garden. It's tucked behind high hedges and shaded by towering plane trees. Their wide, maple-like leaves casting star-shaped shadows across the ground. You push aside a curtain of hanging vines and enter. And there it is, the Garden of Kings. This section is larger, broader, more theatrical. Everything here is dialed up by one notch, but only one. Persian design never screams. It whispers luxuriously. The pool in the center isn't circular or square. It's rectangular, long and serene. With its edges so sharp, they look like someone sliced a piece of sky and laid it on the ground. This is the paradise garden of Cyrus the Great, or at least its imagined descendant. The original, described by Greek historians and buried under the sands of Pasargadae, was said to be as much a royal throne as any jewel-encrusted chair. Here, the garden was the crown. You stroll along the edge of the pool, past stone columns that once held silk awnings, and you try to picture the scene. The king, seated on a shaded platform, surrounded by courtiers, generals, and foreign ambassadors. All of them sweating politely in the shade, pretending not to notice that the only person truly comfortable was the man with the longest beard and best throne placement. The royal garden wasn't just for lounging. It was political theater. Every tree was a subtle boast. Every exotic bird, a foreign alliance. Every reflection in the water, a calculated image of serenity and power. And yet, it never felt forced. You sit beside a date palm, its fronds heavy and arching. These trees, imported from the Mesopotamian plains, were symbols of fertility and trade. Their fruit was both dessert and declaration. Offering someone a date under a tree like this was basically the ancient Persian version of saying, "Welcome to my empire. Also, try the appetizers." Historians still argue whether Cyrus himself designed the garden layout or simply instructed his architects to make it stunning. Either way, it worked. Even centuries later, Alexander the Great is said to have visited these gardens and lingered, perhaps out of admiration, perhaps because the palace rooms were too stuffy. You lean back, propped against a marble lion statue, and gaze at the pool. Reflected in its perfect surface are rows of pomegranate trees, their branches still bearing fruit. The orbs dangle like red lanterns, ripening slowly, silently, beneath a moonlit sky. These weren't accidental plantings. They were chosen for symbolism. Pomegranates for life and prosperity. Cypress trees for immortality. Plane trees for shade and symmetry. Every plant was a sentence in the garden's grand monologue. You imagine the king walking here at dawn, perhaps with a trusted advisor or favored poet. He'd pause by the reflecting pool, toss in a date pit, and watch the ripples disturb the stars. Then, he might turn and say something deeply philosophical, like, "It's too hot today. Cancel the parade." Nearby, you spot a raised platform with wide cushions and low tables. This was where music would play, where dancers would perform, where poetry would float on the breeze like mist. In royal gatherings, musicians were hidden among the trees, playing flutes and zithers from behind rose bushes. The goal was not to impress with volume, but with invisibility. The garden sang, and no one could see the source. You find yourself imagining one of those royal evenings now. The faint glow of oil lamps. The hum of string instruments. The occasional peacock strutting through the background like a diva looking for attention. Yes, they had peacocks. Exotic animals were often kept in royal gardens. Deer, gazelles, birds of every color. They wandered freely, living decorations, emblems of the kingdom's reach. If you saw a flamingo while sipping your quince juice, it was meant to remind you, this garden touches every corner of the known world. Even the paths were different here, wider, lined with smooth pebbles and carved stones bearing inscriptions, poetic fragments, imperial slogans, and occasionally a philosophical musing like, "True power is knowing when to offer shade." You pause and smile. Not bad advice, really. The Garden of Kings wasn't about excess. It was about restraint. The genius of Persian royal gardens was that they never screamed wealth. They implied it. Through stillness, through symmetry, through silence louder than any gold trumpet. And even now, long after the kings have faded into legend, the garden still performs, still calms, still conquers. As you wander deeper into the royal garden now, the space subtly transforming. The air is still cool, the marble still smooth, but the energy shifts. Just a touch. The geometry remains perfect, the plants still precisely placed, but something here feels playful. And then you hear it. A faint screech, followed by a low trill and a distant confused squawk. You've entered the Peacock Court. Yes. The ancient Persian kings had birds, not just any birds. Royal, preposterously decorative, sometimes grumpy, always majestic peacocks, strutting across the courtyard with the bored entitlement of minor nobility. They weren't just for fun. These exotic creatures were status symbols, imported from India or Africa and kept in carefully managed garden enclosures, or allowed to roam designated bird zones. You can almost see one now, tail trailing behind like a sequined cape, eyeing you like it might charge or request grapes. And it wasn't just birds. Some of the grandest gardens featured miniature menageries, deer, swans, parrots, even lions in rare cases, though one imagines guests were only impressed by those from a very safe distance. For the truly wealthy, a royal garden was an ecosystem. It didn't just mimic paradise, it contained it. But tonight, no lions, just doves cooing overhead, and that ever-watchful peacock staring at you like it's writing a memoir. You move on, passing into a colonnaded pavilion, where wide openings overlook a still pool dotted with floating flower petals. It's here, you imagine, where the real events happened. Garden banquets, intimate recitals, late-night musings over too much saffron wine. You glance to the side and spot a platter of fruit, figs, dates, maybe a few grapes rolling dramatically close to the edge. It's not real, of course, but you can picture it. And now, dear listener, imagine the scene. It's a spring evening. The king is reclined on a cushioned platform. Guests fan themselves with feathered hand fans. Musicians begin a soft, repetitive rhythm on a santur, a dulcimer that sounds like stardust falling down a marble staircase. A poet clears his throat. Everyone pretends to listen, and the aroma of roasting lamb curls through the air. This was the royal pool party, Persian style. Instead of cannonballs and inflatable donuts, you had perfumed water, scented oil lamps, and occasional floating trays of desserts. Fruit was chilled in snow brought down from distant mountains and stored in underground yakchals. Bowls of sherbet, a mix of fruit, rose water, and ice, were passed around to guests, sometimes perfumed with violets or saffron. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were solemn political salons or veiled excuses for indulgence. Likely, they were both. Politics, poetry, and pomegranates, served with flair, and just a hint of soft scandal. You pause beside a carved stone table, worn smooth by centuries. You imagine hands drumming on it, laughter echoing, a spilled cup, a whispered joke, someone pretending not to notice someone else. The royal garden wasn't just for show. It was the original networking lounge, and far more charming than any conference room. Beyond the pavilion, you step into a moonlit orchard. The trees arranged in symmetrical rows, the space between them wide enough for dancers or strolling lovers. A silk curtain flutters between two cypress trees, perhaps marking off the women's section, where royal ladies enjoy their own evening air, music, and quiet mischief. Yes, the court was divided, but not always rigidly. In royal gardens, the barriers softened. Overhanging branches made convenient shade and even more convenient eavesdropping opportunities. A glance across the pool, a secret passed via servant, a poem dropped accidentally near the wrong cushion. The garden was a setting for courtship, subtle, coded, ceremonial, and just like everything else here, it was choreographed with almost comical precision. You sit again beneath a fig tree, its twisted limbs gnarled from time and memory. Above you, the fruit glows faintly in the moonlight. Sweet, secretive, and soft. You pluck one, split it open. Inside, it's pink, messy, irresistible. Some say the Persian royal gardens were theatrical sets, designed to frame the monarch, to awe visitors, to perform power. And yes, they were all those things. But sitting here, with peacock feathers rustling behind you and flower-scented air curling around your ankles, you start to believe something else. These weren't just sets. They were living poems. And every leaf, every breeze, every echo off the marble was a verse in a song meant to soothe, seduce, and subtly impress. And here you are now, 2,500 years late to the party, but just in time for the night's final encore. You stay a while longer beneath the fig tree, lazily nibbling what's left of the fruit, the night thick with scent and starlight. But now, as the garden grows quieter still, your attention drifts to the human stories embedded in this place. Not just kings and queens, but whispers of courtiers, servants, and soft scandals passed between shadows and pomegranate branches. You're entering the realm of Persian garden gossip. Yes, even paradise had its murmurs. You walk slowly toward a covered colonnade at the far side of the courtyard, the kind where soft voices once echoed off the stone. The cushions are still there, faint indentations in their fabric. You sit. The silence here is a little different. Not the hush of nature, but the hush of people trying not to be overheard. Imagine the scene centuries ago, a high-ranking courtier sitting just where you are now, fanning himself with a palm leaf while subtly scanning the garden for his rival. Two noble women in the corner, murmuring behind a fan that's far more decorative than functional. A servant pretending to refill sherbet while definitely listening in. The Persian royal garden wasn't just a place of rest. It was a stage for courtly performance, both political and romantic. These spaces, so carefully cultivated, were perfect for calculated encounters and calculated avoidance. You stroll through a hedge-lined walkway now, the walls of greenery forming perfect screens. Just the kind of place one might casually bump into someone they'd never planned to see. Historians still argue whether garden layouts were deliberately designed to allow such chance encounters, or whether the geometry just lent itself so naturally to intrigue. Either way, it worked. One poet wrote that, "Beneath the vine, secrets are safe," which is a charming way of saying everyone knew this was where the drama happened. You pause by a pomegranate tree, its low branches thick with heavy fruit. Pomegranates, symbol of love, fertility, temptation, and, very possibly, the fruit passed discreetly between two flirtatious guests trying not to make eye contact. These trees were often planted near pathways or alcoves, places where one might pause, accidentally linger, or drop a scrap of poetry. Some gardens even featured private garden rooms, open air but screened with curtains or dense plantings, allowing for conversations that didn't echo too far. You peek into one now, just stone benches, a fountain, and silence. But if walls could talk, in some courts, it said the garden was more powerful than the throne room. A well-timed compliment beside the reflecting pool might open doors that remained sealed by official channels, and a romantic rivalry, sparked beneath a flowering orange tree, could shift alliances faster than any royal decree. Of course, not all gossip was romantic. You imagine a line of advisors walking slowly beside the central canal, pretending to discuss irrigation systems while actually trading tidbits about who had fallen out of favor this week. Or perhaps a musician reporting that someone sang slightly off-key during last night's performance, thereby guaranteeing exile to the provinces. You return to the main courtyard now, where low seating areas are arranged like the petals of a flower. Another subtle cue that all conversations here would bloom outward. Even the furniture encouraged story sharing. Servants passed through frequently, not just with refreshments, but with ears open. Sometimes, it was the gardener who knew everything before the vizier did. But it wasn't just the courtiers whispering. The poets, too, found inspiration here. You sit beside a carved marble basin and imagine a man in flowing robes, quill in hand, murmuring verses beneath his breath. The garden was more than a muse. It was a mirror of longing, loss, desire, and dignity. And gossip? That was just a softer form of storytelling. You glance again at the peacock strutting past. It pauses, stares, as if it knows something, as if it's seen things. You raise an eyebrow. Yes, it seems to say. Even I have secrets. You laugh quietly. And suddenly, everything feels more human. For all its divine symmetry, the garden was never just a symbol of perfection. It was a canvas for real people, with all their flaws, ambitions, jealousies, and little rebellions. It was where someone nervously rehearsed a confession, where someone else eavesdropped from behind a mulberry tree, where a love story bloomed and withered in the same week. You rest now beside the long reflecting pool, staring into its dark, glassy surface. If you look long enough, you almost expect to see their shadows flicker across the water. A servant glancing over her shoulder, a scribe hiding a letter in his sleeve, a queen pretending not to watch someone she shouldn't. The garden doesn't judge. It simply remembers. And tonight, it remembers everything. You're still beside the pool. The stars reflected in its stillness like old friends who've come to gossip politely with the surface. But now, as the garden holds you gently in its memory, your ears pick up something unexpected, a faint hum, not from a bird or a breeze, but something more human, something made with intention. Music. It drifts toward you like vapor, barely more than breath, and you follow it through an arched walkway where flowering vines droop like curtains and arrive at a smaller courtyard. This one intimate, enclosed, and softly lit by lanterns. Here, in this secluded haven, you enter the realm of Sasanian soundscapes. Yes, long before Spotify playlists and background lo-fi beats, the Persians knew how to craft an atmosphere. And nowhere did they do it with more subtlety than in the garden. The Sasanian Empire, which flourished from the 3rd to the 7th century CE, was a golden age for Persian aesthetics. Their palaces and gardens weren't just beautiful, they were immersive. Spaces were designed not only for the eye, but for the ear, for the heart. And the sound of a garden was part of its design. You sit on a silk-cushioned bench in a narrow pavilion. Around you, silk curtains sway slightly in the breeze, their movement nearly soundless, but somehow musical in rhythm. Nearby, musicians would once have played, never loudly, never to perform, but to accompany the garden like a second breeze. The instruments were modest in size, but rich in tone. You might hear the soft pluck of a barbat, a lute-like instrument, the resonant hum of a santur, or the breathy exhale of a ney flute. Each note was chosen not for melody, but for mood, to relax, to reflect, to dissolve the chatter of the mind. You lean back, eyes closed, and try to imagine a performance here. A court poet recites verses in slow cadence, and a musician gently picks a tune beneath his words. The birds join in, unintentionally, but perfectly timed. A fountain provides percussion. A breeze, the harmony. Historians still argue whether these garden performances were strictly formal or more like ambient background rituals. What we do know is that music and poetry were integral to garden life, not add-ons, but threads in the fabric. And the Sasanian rulers weren't shy about showcasing their love for it. There are old illustrations, etched in stone or painted in manuscripts, showing kings reclined on pillows, goblet in hand, surrounded by singers and musicians. The musicians are seated cross-legged, faces serene, and often placed near water. Why? Because the sound of music over water is different. It bends, it expands, it echoes. You open your eyes and look across the small basin in this garden courtyard. It's quiet now, but you know that even the shape of this pool was designed to catch sound. A whispered word at one end could travel to the other like a secret passed through silence. This was no accident. Garden architects knew how acoustics worked, even if they didn't have the modern terms. Curved walls, low ceilings, water surfaces, fabric drapes, they all serve to amplify or muffle, depending on the intent. A place for performance became a space for intimacy, where even a single note mattered. You walk now toward a corner where a low platform is set beneath flowering trees. This was likely a poet's perch. It faces the garden at an angle, not centered, but slightly offset. encouraging a diagonal flow of both sight and sound. There's a spot here for a scribe, too. You imagine them bent over parchment, transcribing verses that had never been written before, poems about the sound of the moonlight, the texture of a fig, the sadness of a rose that bloomed too early. The Persians believed that the garden was a poem in architecture, so it's no surprise that the poets saw themselves as mere translators. The breeze was already composing. The trees were already singing. They were just taking notes. You sit again, your usual position by now, and listen. The garden today may not have a live orchestra or whispering bards, but it still hums. The wind sighs through branches. A nightjar croons once, then falls silent. Water plays in the distance, weaving between fountains. And you realize something beautiful. In a place like this, you don't need lyrics. The sounds are enough. Each one is a stanza. A verse, a sigh, a lullaby you didn't know you'd been waiting for. The garden does not demand applause. It only asks that you listen. You sit there a while longer, soaking in the final notes of that invisible concert. And then you stand, stretching gently, and begin to walk, slower than before. Not out of fatigue, but because it feels wrong to move too quickly here. You step quietly along a stone path lined with lavender and thyme, and as you do, something begins to dawn on you. This garden, this marvel of balance and breeze, didn't stay in Persia. It traveled. Yes, the design of the Persian garden, with its four-part symmetry, central water channels, and cooling techniques, didn't remain locked in the desert. It grew wings and went global, seeding its influence far beyond the arid plains where it was born. You pass beneath an arched trellis now, its vines heavy with moonflowers. Above it, carved discreetly into the stone, is a symbol of four rivers crossing at a center point, the essence of the Chahar Bagh, or four-part garden. This symbol would become one of the most replicated garden blueprints in the world. Let's begin with India. During the height of the Mughal Empire, Persian architects and designers were invited into court. The result? Garden complexes that took Persian design and magnified it, adding layers of marble, towers, and ornamental pools. Think of the garden surrounding the Taj Mahal, a textbook Chahar Bagh, designed not just for beauty, but to echo paradise as described in Islamic texts. You walk now beside a reflecting pool, watching the moon float atop it like a bored queen. And you imagine the Emperor Shah Jahan doing the same, thousands of miles away, mourning his wife in a garden of geometry and grief. And then there's Spain. The Moors, who ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, brought Persian-inspired garden design westward. In Al-Andalus, cities like Cordoba and Granada bloomed with tiled courtyards and trickling fountains. The Alhambra's Generalife gardens, with their narrow pools, carved stone channels, and whispering walls of greenery, are direct descendants of Persian models. You pause beside a low basin with a carved lip and picture a sultan's daughter brushing her fingers across the surface. watching the ripples dance as court poets recited verses beneath the cypress trees. Historians still argue whether these design influences were carried by scholars, soldiers, or sheer admiration. But the effect is clear. Wherever the Persians went, or even whispered, the garden followed. Even France, that land of symmetry and powdered wigs, was not immune. The famous gardens of Versailles, especially in their early design stages, borrowed ideas from Persian layouts. The axial alignment, the combination of grand spectacle and intimate alcoves, the play of water not just as decoration, but as narrator. Louis XIV may have swapped pomegranates for peacocks of gold, but the bones of Persian design were still there, beneath the marble, beneath the fountains, humming quietly. And still, the garden moved on. You think now of places as distant as Kashmir, where Persian-style gardens were carved into mountainsides, layered with terraces and mirrored pools, or Uzbekistan, where tiled courtyards in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara echoed the familiar fourfold path. Some scholars believe the concept of heaven itself, as envisioned in Islamic, Christian, and even some Buddhist texts, was shaped by Persian garden imagery. Not golden streets and clouds, but green shade, running water, cool air, and peace. You reach a small alcove now, where a stone tablet has been set into the ground. The inscription is worn, but you can just make out a Persian proverb. The garden is not a place. It is a way of walking. You smile, because yes, it's true. This was never just about plants or walls. The Persian garden was a philosophy, one that said nature and man could live in balance, that geometry could be sacred, that silence was as important as speech, and that paradise, well, sometimes it could be planted. You stand again and look around. Everything you've seen tonight, the windcatchers, the mosaics, the pathways of scent, the musicians hidden behind the myrtle bushes, all of it began here, in places like this, and all of it still echoes in gardens half a world away. Because paradise may have Persian roots, but it blooms everywhere. You're standing now at the edge of a broad stone path, lined with boxwood hedges and softly rustling jasmine. The scent catches in your breath, as comforting as something you once smelled in a dream. And just ahead, beyond the final arch, you see it. A garden entrance adorned with elegant calligraphy and glazed tiles in deep blue and gold. You pass through the arch, and suddenly, the space feels different, familiar, but not quite the same. It's quieter, more symmetrical. You realize you've stepped into a new chapter of the garden's life, one shaped not by kings and ancient empires, but by the arrival of Islam. The garden doesn't lose itself here. It adapts. When Islam came to Persia in the 7th century, it didn't wipe away the old traditions. It absorbed them, reframed them, and in the case of the garden, elevated them into something spiritually profound. You stand in what was once a Seljuk courtyard, square in shape, each side lined with arcades and adorned with soft-toned tiles. The central pool reflects the arch geometry perfectly, and around you, the walls bear inscriptions, Quranic verses about paradise, rest, peace, and flowing rivers. The Persian Garden became more than pleasure. It became a model for heaven. The Quran describes paradise as gardens beneath which rivers flow, a phrase repeated dozens of times. For the faithful, building a garden in this life was not just comfort, it was preparation. A way to mirror the eternal, a place to practice stillness. And so, the four-part Chahar Bagh was embraced fully by Islamic builders. Its symmetry became sacred, a metaphor for divine order. You see it everywhere, in the layout, in the alignment with cardinal directions, even in the way trees were planted to represent spiritual virtues, patience, humility, devotion. Historians still debate whether these meanings were imposed later or were intended from the start. But one thing is certain: the Islamic Persian Garden was a place where geometry met theology, and where silence was prayer. You pause beside a carved mihrab niche, not in a mosque, but placed within a garden wall. It's oriented toward Mecca, a quiet suggestion that even while walking through roses, your heart could be turning toward the divine. And it's not just the structure that changed, it's the experience. Islamic garden design emphasized contemplation. Fewer wild birds, more ordered paths, less chaotic color, more serene palettes, greens, whites, the soft blush of desert roses. It wasn't about impressing anymore. It was about inviting stillness. You walk slowly now through a covered walkway, vines dangling like lace. The flooring here is glazed tile, its pattern repeating endlessly, a geometric meditation. The design pulls your gaze toward the center, then outward again. You find yourself walking more slowly without realizing it. A fountain gurgles nearby, its spout shaped like a lotus blossom, symbolic of divine purity in many traditions. The water flows outward into four shallow streams, echoing the four rivers of paradise: water, milk, honey, and wine. You resist the urge to taste the water, just in case someone got too literal with the metaphor. There's a kind of sacred boredom here, where nothing happens quickly, and every corner of the garden urges you to pause. The scent of damask roses thickens the air. You feel, quite suddenly, as if you're not supposed to be doing anything. That maybe the whole point of this garden is to stop being a person who does things, and instead become someone who simply is. You pass by a cluster of olive trees, their leaves flickering silver in the breeze. Beneath them, benches carved from cedar wood invite meditation. This wasn't the domain of royalty anymore. It was a garden for the soul, for the scholar, the mystic, the weary traveler who needed shade and silence. Sufi poets often wrote about gardens as metaphors for the inner self. The soil was the heart. The water was the divine. The gardener, the seeker, every weed pulled, every stone placed, an act of purification. You sit beneath one of the olive trees now and wonder, how much of this still grows inside you? Some scholars believe Persian gardens after Islam were designed with scriptural structure in mind. The number of pathways, the direction of windcatchers, even the height of trees could correspond to verses or symbolic teachings. It's hard to know how much was math, how much was faith, but the result is undeniable. Even now, the air here feels closer to silence. You close your eyes and feel the garden's rhythm. Water, breeze, leaf, breath. This is no longer just an escape from heat or noise or chaos. This is an escape from the self, a rehearsal space for heaven, a garden not just of beauty, but of meaning. And somehow, it's still growing. You're still beneath the olive tree, the ground cool, the air still holding the soft breath of night, but from somewhere not far off. A word rises in the silence, a whispered name carried on the wind. Hafez, and then another, Rumi. You smile, because now, at last, we've arrived at the most fragrant corner of the Persian garden, the corner of poetry. A place where words bloom as easily as roses, and silence is merely the pause between verses. You stand, your robe rustling gently, and step into a literary nook of the garden, one designed not for politics or performance, but for contemplation, reading, and recitation. The path here is narrower. The trees lean in like listeners. You pass a stone bench beside a slender canal, and beside it, a carved stand for a book. Yes, the garden had its own library shelf. Poets in Persian culture weren't side acts. They were pillars of the soul. Their verses were considered both entertainment and moral compass. And where better to ponder the mysteries of love, longing, and divine beauty than in a place where flowers, shade, and silence all conspire to turn you inward? You pause by the canal, kneel, and pretend to read. You don't need a book. The garden is the book. You hear a line in your mind, not yours, but Hafez's. I wish I could show you, when you are lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. And suddenly, the water beside you feels deeper than it looks. Historians still argue whether these poets were fully integrated into royal court life or remained, like many artists, slightly inconvenient mystics. But one thing's clear: Persian gardens were saturated with poetry. Literally. Walls bore verses carved into tile. Fountains were etched with couplets. Even the layout of certain gardens referenced famous stanzas. The Persian tradition of ghazal, lyric poems about love, loss, and divine yearning, was often experienced in the garden. Not just read at a desk, the spaces themselves became metaphors. The rose represented the beloved, the nightingale, the lover. The thorn, well, love is never easy. You walk along a path dappled with moonlight and come to a raised marble platform beneath a plane tree. This, you imagine, was a place where poets gathered, maybe with a cup of wine, secretly, or not. Maybe with a friend, maybe with no one, but the stars. You sit, and now it's your turn. You whisper a few lines, improvised, half-formed, half-dreamed. The garden doesn't judge. It listens. And maybe, just maybe, it writes back. The breeze carries jasmine to your nose. A single pomegranate falls, thuds softly on the grass. A bird calls once, then stillness. Even the structure of the garden follows poetic rhythm. Persian poetry often moves in balanced couplets, each line answering or complementing the other. The garden echoes this: path and counterpath, tree and reflection, silence and sound. It's a living ghazal. You pass a small alcove now, set into the garden wall. Inside is a stone water basin with an inscription in delicate Nastaliq script. In the shade of roses, the soul forgets time. You lean down and touch the surface of the water. It's perfectly still, perfectly cool, and for a moment, it feels like time has truly stopped. Not ended, just paused, as if the garden is holding its breath so you can remember yourself. Nearby, you notice a rose bush, a real one, blooming even at this hour, its petals heavy with dew. This, of course, is Hafez's rose. He wrote of it endlessly. The rose that reveals, the rose that betrays, the rose that reminds you you're alive and always aching for more. Even the poets who had no physical gardens wrote about them obsessively. For them, the garden was the interior world made visible, a place of ordered beauty that promised peace, but only if you dared to stop moving. You find yourself beside another poet's favorite spot, a small bridge of stone arching over a canal. You step onto it, pause in the center, and look down at the reflection, not just of the stars, but of yourself, framed by trees, lit by moonlight, a passerby in paradise. And maybe that's what the poets meant all along, that the garden isn't just outside you. It's a place you carry, a place you remember when you're tired, or heartbroken, or lost. And tonight, you've returned. You, Rumi, Hafez, and the rose. And none of you are in a hurry to leave. You linger on the little stone bridge, the kind that doesn't need to span much water, just enough for reflection. The canal beneath continues to murmur softly, as if reciting poetry of its own, echoing verses long since dissolved in the air. But then, as you step off and return to the path, something shifts. A new thought stirs. You're in a place so serene, so perfectly designed to quiet the mind, that you begin to feel a tug, not of beauty or scent this time, but of thought. The Persian Garden, you realize, was never only about comfort. It was also about contemplation. This was a space not just for the senses, but for philosophy. And so tonight, we sit beside the fountain of thought, quite literally. You return to a central water basin, square and simple, yet inexplicably mesmerizing. And you sit and think. The Persians believed that water wasn't only for growing things or cooling air. It was a mirror, both physical and spiritual. Gazing into a calm basin could trigger not just vanity or admiration, but a sense of cosmic orientation. The still surface of water reflects not just stars and clouds, but the mind itself. You lean in. There you are, tired, thoughtful, a little sweaty, still handsome. But look closer. The garden reflects more than your face. It reflects time. How long it's been since you slowed down, since you let beauty be more than decoration, since you let a breeze change your entire mood. Historians still argue whether Persian gardens were built with philosophical symbolism in mind, or whether the thinkers just couldn't help but see symbols in everything. Either way, the result is the same. These gardens became spaces for discourse, for pondering not just politics and poetry, but existence. You walk now along a path lined with cypress trees, tall, narrow, enduring. The ancient Zoroastrians considered the cypress a sacred tree. Why? Because it never changes with the seasons. It's evergreen, unmoving, unbothered. The perfect metaphor for the eternal self, the soul that stays centered as the world stumbles around it. And here's a quirky detail. Many Persian scholars and mystics would pace their gardens while thinking, not in a hurried, anxious way, but in what some texts call measured meanderings, a sort of walking meditation. You try it now. Slow steps, breath aligned, hands clasped behind your back like a 12th century philosopher with opinions about shadows. You pause beneath a trellis of grapevines, where sunlight would have once filtered through leaves, turning thought into warmth. Above your head, tiny bunches of unripe grapes dangle like green punctuation marks. You consider, just for fun, what kind of fruit your own mind would grow. If it were a tree, a fig, probably. Slightly disorganized, but sweet. The garden around you starts to feel less like a space and more like a conversation. With yourself. With time. With the idea that everything is temporary, but also, somehow, eternal. The water flows, the flowers bloom, the marble cools, and all of it asks questions you don't quite have to answer. You reach another bench, carved into the wall, just beside a series of stepped fountains. Water cascades from one level to the next, not in roaring drops, but soft, thoughtful trickles. Each level catches the water just long enough to consider it, before letting it fall again. You feel like the water might be smarter than you. It doesn't rush. It doesn't hoard. It moves, slowly, always downward, always forward. Some Islamic philosophers called this kind of flowing water Ma'ul Hayawan, living water. Water that moves is water that teaches, that shows you how to adapt, how to be cool in the heat, how to offer refreshment without force, how to reflect, then release. You sit and watch the water for a long time. No phone, no screen, no goals. Just ripples and moonlight and a quiet mind. And this This moment of stillness is the point. The garden has led you here not by instruction, but by invitation. It didn't ask you to be clever, or productive, or wise. It simply asked you to be present, to breathe in, to breathe out, and maybe, just maybe, to realize that the most profound truths are sometimes found beside a trickling fountain, surrounded by trees that don't need to speak to be understood. And in this moment, you understand something. The Persian garden isn't just beautiful, it's wise. The garden has made a philosopher of you, gently, without trying. But don't worry, tonight, you're not expected to solve the mysteries of the universe, only to notice them. And now, as you stretch your legs once more and follow the garden's quiet rhythm, you begin to see another layer beneath the tranquility, a layer not of poetry or perfume, but of power. Because while the Persian garden might soothe the soul, it also served a more earthly function. It was a power move. You stroll now into a section of the garden that feels subtly elevated, literally and symbolically. The pathways are wider, the fountains larger, the shade somehow deeper. You've stepped into the political wing of paradise. To understand how a courtyard full of roses and water lilies became a flex, you need only look at who built them. Kings, governors, generals, wealthy merchants, people who wanted to impress, intimidate, and inspire, preferably all at once. And what better way to say, I am in control, than by conquering the desert? You pause beside a wide reflecting pool, its surface a perfect glass. Imagine being a visiting dignitary from some rainy kingdom. You've just ridden 6 days through dust and wind, and suddenly you're invited to recline beside a pool so still it reflects the sky better than your own lake back home. Oh, and someone hands you a chilled pomegranate drink without being asked. That's not just hospitality. That's psychological warfare in a velvet robe. Historians agree that Persian gardens were deeply tied to the performance of authority. They weren't separate from governance. They were part of it. Just as palaces were built to be seen, so too were gardens built to be experienced and remembered. You step beneath a canopy of plane trees, the same kind planted along ancient roadways to offer shade to royal processions. These weren't mere landscaping decisions. Every tree was chosen for its symbolism: stability, endurance, generosity. Traits every ruler wanted to radiate. And don't forget water. In an arid climate, water wasn't just nice. It was power made visible. The ability to summon a stream through your courtyard, to direct it with perfect symmetry, to make it gurgle on cue. These were the ancient equivalents of having a fleet of sports cars or a private jet, except way quieter and cooler, literally. Some rulers, like Shah Abbas of the Safavid dynasty, went further, planting gardens along major highways, turning them into rest stops for travelers, scholars, and ambassadors. These were called bag, gardens, but they were also statements of territory and hospitality. You didn't just ride through the king's land. You drank his water, sat under his trees, and realized whose name ruled the wind. You reach a platform now, raised above the garden floor. From here, you can see the entire layout, a perfect grid of symmetry and shade. It was from such vantage points that rulers surveyed not just their gardens, but their vision of order. A well-kept garden reflected a well-kept state, balanced, peaceful, generous. And if a guest got too comfortable, well, the thorn bushes around the perimeter weren't just for security. They were metaphors too. Even the materials used spoke of power. White marble imported from afar, cypress trees that took decades to grow, water piped in from kilometers away via underground Qanats. The labor, the coordination, the wealth required to maintain such an ecosystem, it wasn't lost on anyone walking through. You sit on the edge of the platform now, feet dangling over the polished stone. Below, water flows through a narrow rill, flanked by low garden beds. You try to imagine how many decisions, political, financial, agricultural, it took to make that trickle happen. And that's when you realize something. This garden, for all its peace, was work. Its stillness was curated. Its silence was budgeted. Its shade was the result of power applied with elegance. But it wasn't just a show for outsiders. Even within the court, the garden was a stage. Rulers might invite ministers here for walk and talks. A decision made beneath the fig tree carried more diplomacy than one shouted in a marble hall. Some monarchs issued proclamations from beneath grape arbors. Others heard petitions near the fountains, letting the flow of water fill the awkward silences. The garden let the ruler appear calm, wise, in control, even when they weren't. You lie back now on the warm platform, the stone holding the last breath of the sun. The stars overhead blink sleepily, and the wind carries the faintest scent of basil. Yes, the Persian garden was beauty. Yes, it was philosophy. Yes, it was paradise. But never forget, it was also a throne made of trees. And sometimes, the greatest displays of power don't shout, they bloom. You lie there for a while on the platform, feeling strangely regal, like a poet king who forgot to bring his to-do list and decided to nap instead. The garden has become your crown now, its silence your scepter, but as you stretch and let your feet return to the ground, you start to notice something new in the layout. Not the plants, not the paths, but the people who once moved through them, and more specifically, how they were divided. Because while the Persian garden was a place of shared shade and common beauty, it was also a place of carefully curated separation. And that included gender. Tonight, you stroll gently into the world of gendered garden zones, where the rose-scented air was the same, but the experience of it was not. You walk along a colonnade toward a section partially enclosed by hedges and soft walls. The space here feels more intimate. Smaller pools, cozier pavilions, and vines that hang a little lower, as if shielding whispers. This is likely what once would have been the women's garden, a space reserved for the royal harem, noble women, or female guests. It wasn't hidden out of shame. It was protected, guarded like the petals of a flower not meant to be trampled by sandals full of statecraft. Historians still argue about how separate these zones really were. Were they fully walled off? Lightly screened? Did women have their own gardens entirely, or shared spaces with dedicated hours? The answers shift depending on the era, the dynasty, and the degree of social formality. But one thing is clear: they had their own world. And what a world it must have been. You imagine soft laughter drifting across the vines, women in embroidered robes reclining beneath citrus trees, sharing poems, teaching their daughters which flowers to steep in which teas, discussing which nobleman wore his belt too tight and who smelled like camel butter that week. You pass through a narrow stone arch and find yourself in a mirror image garden, the same layout as the larger royal court, but scaled down. A central pool, pomegranate trees, roses in symmetrical plots, and benches, many benches, because conversation here was the main event. Here, under the cypress shade, the concerns were different. Not war, not trade routes, but alliances, family affairs, poetry, fashion, and perhaps occasionally a glance passed over a screen, catching a fleeting moment of courtly flirtation. You pause beside a carved marble basin, and for a moment, you imagine one of the palace women dipping her fingers into the water and pretending not to be bored while someone recites a 1,000-line poem about the moon. And while the men might have had their wine-soaked banquets and political chess matches, the women weren't idle. Some of them were formidable patrons of art, design, and even garden architecture. The mother of Shah Abbas, for example, was deeply involved in the commissioning of buildings and religious complexes, and likely gardens too. Though the men got all the credit, as usual. You lean against a lattice screen, where light patterns dance across your robe. You realize the space here is not just smaller, it's softer, more shade, more fragrance, more spaces for quiet. The scent paths here were designed to wind a little more slowly, to linger longer on jasmine and violet before turning toward rose. Even the water features here had a different rhythm, gentler, more melodic. Instead of grand cascades, you find ripple pools, where water bounces in tiny concentric rings, like a conversation that never quite ends. And yes, this area had rules. Certain gardens had appointed times for male and female use. Others had designated zones, with screens and hedges serving as polite suggestions rather than brick walls. But the separation wasn't always about confinement. Sometimes it was about curated comfort, a space designed to reflect the rhythms of women's lives, full of caretaking, creativity, and community. You sit on a low stool near a patch of flowering herbs, lavender, chamomile, mint. The garden here smells like a tea that could cure sadness. And you realize that this too was power. Not the power of conquest, but the power of connection. These women shaped families, whispered behind political curtains, and sometimes, just sometimes, rewrote the script altogether. You can almost hear it now. Laughter behind fans, the rustle of silk, the clink of cups, stories traded like treasures, secrets shared with the roses, who never tattled. And you wonder, how many lives were changed right here, beneath this arbor? How many love letters began on one bench and ended at another? How many choices were made, quietly, gently, but with lasting impact? Because while the kings sat in council beneath marble domes, the queens, the sisters, the daughters, they sat in the garden, and they remembered everything. The quiet of the women's garden lingers like perfume in the air as you step away, back into the wider symmetry of the royal courtyard. But something feels different now, not the breeze. It still carries its fragrant hush, not the stones. They're still cool beneath your feet. No, it's the garden itself. You begin to notice the wear, a crack in the fountain's marble lip, a vine overgrown where it once obeyed strict geometry, and the distant echo of footfalls, but no footsteps follow. You've reached the era of waning glory. Even the most carefully cultivated paradise cannot escape the slow fade of time. And the Persian garden, immortal in design, was still subject to the mortal errors of empire, economy, and entropy. You wander now into a section where the flowers have thinned. The gravel path is more patchy. A gate hangs slightly askew on its bronze hinge. You imagine a later dynasty, perhaps one with tighter budgets, fewer guests, and an empire no longer eager to impress. Historians agree. By the later Qajar period, 18th, 19th centuries, many of Persia's once grand gardens began to fall into quiet neglect. The reasons were many: political instability, foreign invasions, the shifting tastes of rulers, the sheer cost of water management. And speaking of water, the pool before you is shallow now, no longer a mirror, but a dusty basin. The Qanats, once the arteries of the garden, were harder to maintain. Skilled muqannis, those master diggers, were fewer. Funds were redirected, and without constant care, the underground systems clogged or collapsed. Some rulers still built gardens, of course, but they were smaller, simpler, more gesture than paradise. The kind of garden that said, "We remember what this used to mean," but didn't have the coin or the conviction to keep it alive. You sit on a bench that leans just slightly. It squeaks beneath your weight. You imagine an aging courtier seated here once, muttering that, in my day, the roses were twice as red. You can't help but smile. Every generation believes the past was grander, but sometimes it really was. Even the plants changed. Exotic trees once imported with ceremony were no longer replaced when they died. Ornamental shrubs were left to grow wild. Some gardens were turned into grazing land. Others simply vanished beneath dust and forgetfulness. But still, something persisted. You spot a damask rose blooming stubbornly beside a crumbling wall. Its scent is strong, unapologetic, a reminder Because even when the garden fell out of favor, it never entirely disappeared. The memory lingered, the layout remained. The bones of paradise held firm. Some scholars say that during these later years, the Persian Garden took on a nostalgic role, not just a place to host poetry, but a symbol of lost order, lost glory, a yearning for a better time. And so, even in decay, the gardens retain their dignity. You walk now through a shaded walkway where tiles have fallen from the walls. Some remain, sky blue, sun-bleached, their calligraphy worn smooth by sand and rain. A fragment reads, "This, too, shall pass." A fitting eulogy, and yet, in this faded corner, you notice a new sound, children laughing. You follow it and find a family gathered near an old fountain. The children run barefoot, their feet slapping stone. One scoops water in a brass bowl and splashes her brother. Their parents sit beneath a fig tree, sipping tea from clay cups. It isn't royal. It isn't symmetrical. But it's still paradise. You sit nearby and watch. The garden may have lost its crown, but it hasn't lost its soul. It was never only about kings. After all, the Persian Garden, at its heart, was about making peace with the desert and offering people a space to rest, to breathe, to exist in balance. So even in decline, the garden did its job. It offered shade. It reflected stars. It remembered poetry. It endured. And as the family packs up their things and the sun begins its slow descent, you feel a softness return to the air. The breeze picks up. A few birds call from the trees. And suddenly, the garden feels less like a ruin and more like a sleeping promise. One that says, "I am still here, I am waiting, and I remember." The garden is quiet again. The laughter of the children has faded into the long corridors of memory, and only the gentle rustle of leaves remains, like the whisper of an old storyteller clearing her throat before the next chapter. You walk now toward a gate near the far end of the garden, one once polished with ceremonial brass, now creaking with a sort of tired dignity. Beyond it lies a chapter the garden never asked for, but could not avoid: the age of foreign misunderstanding. Yes, we've arrived at the era of colonial misinterpretations. You step into a slightly different section, less shaded. The walls taller, less delicate. The geometry is still here, but it feels misread. You glance around and notice peculiar additions: marble statues where rose bushes once bloomed, gravel paths that ignore water channels, and, most suspiciously, a large fountain that doesn't trickle, but shoots water upward in a grand jet. You sigh. This was someone else's idea of elegance. During the 18th and 19th centuries, as Western powers expanded their influence in the East, many European architects, diplomats, and adventurers encountered Persian gardens. But they didn't always see what was truly there. Instead of quiet symmetry and ecological genius, they saw exotic flair, or worse, landscape templates to be improved. You walk past a paved courtyard, harsh lines replacing soft soil. A sculpture of a Roman goddess posed awkwardly beside a lemon tree. The design clashes. The materials are wrong, and the water, now spraying skyward like it's auditioning for a city square in Paris, seems embarrassed. Historians still argue how much of this was deliberate appropriation and how much was clumsy admiration. In some cases, Persian gardens were reinterpreted by foreign architects who didn't understand or simply ignored the original philosophy. Water was made dramatic instead of meditative. Plants were chosen for appearance, not for scent or utility. And the sacred geometry was flattened into symmetry without soul. You pause beside a flower bed shaped like a starburst. It's pretty, but it feels forced. One French ambassador once described a Persian garden as a fine place for a stroll. If only it had more marble statues and fewer pomegranates. You mutter under your breath something unrepeatable in polite gardens. But here's the strange part. Even in being misread, the Persian garden still managed to whisper its truth. You turn a corner and find, behind a wall clearly added later, an original Shahar Bagh quadrant, untouched, overgrown, but quietly perfect. The central water rill still flows, shaded by twin plane trees, a single rose, somehow surviving, nods in the breeze. It's like finding a lost poem scribbled in the margins of a travel guide. You sit beside the narrow canal and think of all the gardens that were paved over, redesigned, or imported into palaces across Europe and stripped of their soul. Versailles borrowed the form, but missed the function. Victorian greenhouses copied the flower selections, but forgot about shade. And yet, pieces of the garden still got through. A courtyard in Spain, a colonnade in India, a domed pavilion in Venice. All of them faint echoes of the original Persian ideal, misunderstood, misused, but never fully erased. You rest now on a bench that was clearly meant for posing, angled toward the central fountain-turned water cannon. It's a bench meant for portraits, not poetry. And yet, even here, the breeze still carries the scent of jasmine. The water still cools the air. And the marble beneath your hand still remembers how to stay cool. The garden forgives. It always has. Because at its core, it wasn't built to impress foreigners or withstand historical misreadings. It was built to soothe the living, to teach you, gently, how to slow down, how to listen, how to remember. You stand and look once more at the clashing courtyard, the imported sculpture, the straight hedge lines, the tiled fountain in the wrong place. And then you close your eyes. You let the garden reassemble itself, not as it became, but as it was. You hear a nightingale. You smell mint and fig, and the sound of a fountain, trickling, not boasting. And just like that, the misunderstanding falls away, and the real garden remains. You open your eyes. The breeze has shifted, ever so slightly. It's cooler now, cleaner. It smells not of roses, but of fresh paint and turned soil. You're no longer standing in an ancient court. The marble beneath your feet is new, cut from modern quarries, laid by recent hands. The walls are restored, the water channels flowing again, and in the distance, a gardener hums softly while trimming a hedge. Welcome to the age of restoration, where the Persian garden, once fading into memory, is now being gently coaxed back to life. You walk slowly past a newly rebuilt Badgir, its stucco gleaming under moonlight. You pause and feel the air slipping from its slits, cool, quiet, alive. Someone remembered how to build it. Someone listened. And someone cared enough to restore the breath of the garden. In recent decades, Iran and other nations have begun a quiet renaissance of their historical gardens. At places like Persian Garden in Kashan or Aram Garden in Shiraz, conservationists, architects, and local caretakers have worked together to revive the bones of these ancient spaces, restoring water flow, replanting heritage trees, and perhaps most importantly, inviting people back in. You pass a stone sign, written in Farsi and English. This garden is a registered UNESCO World Heritage Site. You nod, but more than that, you feel it. Not just because it's protected on paper, but because someone pruned those roses this morning. Someone repaired that turquoise tile with a steady hand. Historians still debate how much of this restoration reflects the true original garden and how much is modern interpretation. But what's certain is this: the spirit has returned. You walk toward a recently replanted Chaharbagh quadrant. The trees still young, the vines not yet mature. It lacks the grandeur of the past. But not the intention. Everything here is growing again. Learning to breathe, slowly. Even the Qanats, buried for centuries, are being reopened in some places, repaired by engineers who have to study ancient methods to understand them. The Mukani may be gone, but his legacy is being rediscovered. You reach a new bench, carved from stone but styled in the old way. Sitting here, you watch as a young couple walks slowly along a rill, the woman pointing at a jasmine bush, the man balancing a paper cup of sherbet in one hand and trying not to spill it. A child darts past, chasing a butterfly. Someone's grandmother adjusts her shawl and smiles toward the water. This garden isn't dead. It's growing again. And not just in bricks and plants, but in memory, in pride, in stories passed from elders to children. This is how the kings sat. This is where your great-grandmother used to read Hafez. This is where the roses always came back. You rise and follow the stream to a pavilion where soft music plays from a nearby cafe. A mix of traditional Persian string instruments and modern jazz. It shouldn't work, but it does. Because that's what the garden has always done. Embrace the present without letting go of the past. You peek through a lattice window and see a university group sketching the layout of the canal system. One student asks, "Why is the water channel just slightly off-center?" The professor smiles. Because real beauty is never perfect. You step back into the central path, lined with cypresses. The sun is long gone. Lanterns have taken over now, their light flickering in soft gold arcs across the stone. The shadows are deeper, the air richer. The garden sleeps again, but this time, it sleeps with hope. You pause at the main gate before leaving, and there beside it is a plaque, recently installed. Its inscription is simple, in both Persian and English. To restore a garden is not to return to the past, but to remember how peace is made. You smile, step through the gate, and look back once. The garden stands quietly, holding its breath like always, alive again. The gate swings closed behind you with a soft clunk, but you don't leave just yet. Instead, you linger in the threshold, in that gentle space between worlds, the street and the garden, the now and the timeless, the everyday and the dream. You turn, take a final look, and find yourself drawn one last time through a side path, narrow and overhung with vines. The lanterns grow dimmer here. The gravel crunches just slightly underfoot. You don't know where you're going, but the garden seems to know exactly what you need. And then, you arrive. It's a willow tree, tall, bowed, ancient. Its long, thread-like leaves hang down in gentle curtains, swaying in slow rhythm with the breeze. Beneath it, a low stone bench, half sunken into the earth, edges softened by time. A single pool lies in front of it, not grand, not symmetrical, just a round basin, filled with still water that reflects only darkness and the shimmer of starlight. You sit. This is the eternal shade, the final stop in a garden built not just to please the senses, but to slow the soul. Everything here feels softer, older, quieter. No performance, no perfume, just stillness. You lean back against the trunk of the willow. It creaks faintly. It has seen everything. Kings and birds, poets and lovers, tourists with guidebooks, children dropping ice cream. And now, you. The garden is no longer a marvel to explore. It has become a part of you. Its geometry is your breath. Its silence is your pulse. Its story, slow, deliberate, full of secret wisdom, lingers in your bones. You close your eyes. Somewhere nearby, water moves, just enough to remind you that time is flowing, but not fast. The willow shifts again. The wind cools your cheek. And here, beneath this tree, you begin to forget the sharp edges of the world outside. The chaos, the news cycles, the emails waiting in inboxes. You forget the traffic, the to-do list, even the voice in your head that keeps telling you to be productive. None of that fits in a garden like this, because this garden doesn't ask anything of you. It only offers a pause, a place, a memory that doesn't fade when you open your eyes. And as you exhale, long, slow, steady, you feel yourself fall inward, as though the pool before you were not filled with water, but with rest itself. Sleep comes not as a sudden drop, but as a gentle tide. And just before it claims you, the garden gives one final gift, a silence so deep, You can hear the stars. Now, let your breathing slow. There's no need to rush. You're still beneath the willow. The marble is still cool. The fountain still whispers. And the garden, always patient, keeps its arms around you. The night has deepened now. The shadows have curled into corners, and the stars are steady above, like watchful lanterns. Everything is quieted, even your thoughts, even your muscles, even the corners of your mind you didn't know were tense. In this space, you're safe. Not just because there are no alarms, no bright lights, no deadlines, but because this place was built for rest, crafted stone by stone, breeze by breeze, for the sole purpose of giving peace. Let yourself drift now. There's nothing left to understand, nothing to fix, nothing to prove, only the cool air across your skin, only the scent of earth and jasmine, only the soft breath of a garden older than memory. If your mind begins to wander, let it stroll gently along the gravel paths. Let it pause by the reflecting pool. Let it listen, again, to the trickling of distant water. The garden is still here. It never left. And when you return, tomorrow, or next week, or in another lifetime, it will open its gates for you again. So sleep softly, deeply, and let the garden carry you home. End of script. Sweet dreams.